Hey everyone, Shiny Key here with Crevian. Welcome to video 2 of setting up a multiplayer backend. This was going to build off of the first video where we talked about setting up authentication incognito. This video we're going to be looking at setting up the API, the gateway, the database, and the lambdas that will be required to have our player talk to the backend and get the data that they are going to need. So without further ado, let's start with API Gateway. This is the screen I'm going to be looking at because I already have a few APIs created. You're going to want to come up here and search for API Gateway up here. Your screen, if you have not made an API, may look a little bit different. You may have a get started with API Gateway or a create an API. You just want to get to the screen that I'm looking at right now. This is the first screen here. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to be looking at building a REST API, and we want a public REST API because we want this to be able to be called from the public from your players. Now, public API does not necessarily mean that anyone can call it. We're going to go into that in a little bit to show how we're going to enforce only allowing logged in users to call our API. But we're going to start by building our own REST API. Okay. Now, we need to choose what kind of type of API we want. We're going to do a new API. We don't want to import anything. We don't want to start off of a template. We're going to start from scratch here. We're going to name our API first. So I'm just going to name this My Game API, just as an example. You can put a description here as well. I'm not going to bother, but feel free to. Finally, with the API endpoint, we're going to keep it on regional. You do have a few options here. You have regional, edge optimized, and private. Again, we're not doing private. A private API would be within the AWS cloud ecosystem, so only your services hosted in AWS would be able to call it, and any other services you allow. We're not going to worry about that one. Edge optimized APIs are route requests through CloudFront, which is Amazon's edge gateways. It allows people from all over the world to be able to access an API endpoint closest to them to make your APIs more responsive. We're not going to be touching CloudFront and getting that going in this example. You can change these settings when the API is already created. Regional works just fine for our use cases. Now, something I forgot to mention a little bit earlier in the last video that we'll make sure to mention in this video, make sure that your region is set correctly, whichever region you would like to. I work mostly in US East 1. If you're in a different country and you have a closer region to you, feel free to choose the region that is closest to you and makes the most sense for you. I'm just going to be using US East 1. I'm in the US, and US East 1 makes the most sense for me. It's fairly centralized in the US, so that's usually what I go with and what I pick. So let's go ahead and create an API. Now we're going to be starting at a blank API screen here, and this is all we're going to do for right now. We're going to go backwards and work forward a little bit, and you'll see why that's kind of important in a moment. API Gateway is going to be calling other backend resources, but it's a little hard to call those backend resources if those backend resources don't exist. So let's move over to DynamoDB. This is going to be the database that I am going to choose. Let me pull up my notes here real quick. This is the database I'm going to choose how to use. You are more than welcome to use any other types of databases here. DynamoDB is really great for, it's a no SQL serverless database, which means there is no hosting cost that you have to pay to keep DynamoDB running. It is, as soon as you make a request, it will process the request. There's no overhead, if you will, for hosting this. It's really great for apps, and to be honest, it's pretty good for games as well, because most of the time you don't need a database running all the time. You don't need a lot of those advanced SQL features. DynamoDB, as you'll see when we start getting into more of the front end stuff, is more than sufficient for our needs. So we're going to go over to DynamoDB. You're going to see your dashboard here. I don't have much configured here, which is fine. We're going to want to come over to create a table. Tables are, if you're familiar with other databases, they work exactly the same way as in an SQL database. It is a single table that contains data for us. All right. So the first option here is we need to name our table. I usually call this, I prefix this with the product name. We're just going to call this player data right now, because this is going to be the table that is going to store all of our player data. All right. Next is going to be our partition keys and our sort keys. Now, partition keys and sort keys are a little bit weird. They work very similar to other databases. Your partition key, you can kind of think of as your primary key if you're familiar with other types of databases. This is going to be the key that you are going to use when you're making different calls on your database. It's going to be kind of the identifier, all right? Your sort key is as you can kind of see in the description there, your sort key is a secondary primary key that you may use for context. So maybe you have an ID in your database table, but you also want to pull up any character information that the player have. You want to add a little bit more context to your request to find something. I'm not going to be using a sort key. I'm just going to use the partition key. You are free to play around with the sort key. Keep in mind that once you do make these, you cannot change them. So you cannot go back and add a sort key later, or you cannot change your partition key later. You would have to recreate the table. Pretty easy to do that as long as you don't have to migrate data. But for our partition key, we're just going to call this ID. And this is going to be the user's ID. I'm going to keep the default settings because we're going to try and stay in free tier here. When you get to production, you are going to want to ramp these up a little bit, but for our testing purposes, we're not going to need to ramp up any of this stuff. This is more than fine for our testing purposes. And then we're going to create a table. Believe it or not, we're actually done with setting up the database. The nice thing about DynamoDB is it does not lock you in to a specific format. So in other types of databases, you would have to define every field in your database. You would have to come up with, what do you want to store? Do you want the ID, the character level? You would have to decide that right now for everything that you want. And if you want to add a field, you need to migrate to a new format with a new table. DynamoDB is great. It doesn't care. You can give it whatever it wants in here. If we actually just go in here, you can give it whatever kind of table that you want. And it will just figure itself out. And you are free to change that data in the future if you want to add a field without affecting the existing data. So it's really robust and powerful to be able to expand in the future. We're not going to, like I said, we don't actually need to set up anything else in here. I'll give you a quick tour just so you can kind of see. So just to show you what I'm talking about here, if I come in here and I type in an ID like 1234, and let's say that I want an attribute called character name, and I want that to be Bob. All right, and we're just gonna create this character. So we have our information now. We have ID 1234, character name Bob. Now let's say that we had an update, and oh man, we're gonna make another one. This ID is 12345. We do still have the character name field. And this one's going to be Jerry. But let's say, oh man, you know what? We really actually wanted to store maybe I don't know, an achievement. Let's say like we have some kind of achievement. All right. And we want to make that achievement ID 1. Okay. And I'm going to create that item. Now you'll see here that the field we had before did not have this achievement field, but it went ahead and added it for us anyways. it's just blanked out. We don't have an achievement under this because we didn't specify it at that point in time, but we did specify it for this one. So that's what I'm talking about when you don't need to be locked into a certain format. You're free to add and take away as you need, as your front end demands, and DynamoDB will, for lack of a better term, keep up with you. So we're gonna delete these right now because this is not how we want to do things. And like I said, we're done with setting up the DB. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna go into lambdas. Okay. We're going to create a new function. Okay, so lambdas are functions that run code, obviously, and you're only charged for how long the code takes to run. For the code we're be running, this is milliseconds, sometimes seconds that we're talking about here. Okay, so we're going to make a few functions, but before we actually get into these functions, we need to define a role. So what we're going to do, let me get my notes ready here so I can make sure I'm giving you good information here, all right? We're going to want to come over to, we're going to want to search for roles. And you can kind of see that I already have a role here, but we're going to want to not create a role, I'm sorry, we're going to want to make a policy first. So we're going to create a policy. And let me open up my notes on my other side here so I can make sure that I'm telling you the right information. Okay, we're going to want to create a policy. Now, policies, as we kind of touched on in the last video, policies determine what is allowed to do what. I know that sounds really vague, but by default, services cannot talk to other services unless you explicitly tell them they're allowed to talk to other services, which is great because that helps us a lot with security. However, we need our Lambda functions that we're about to make, we need to allow them to talk to our backend database. So hopefully you didn't close it out. If you did, it's okay. We actually need to go back to DynamoDB here. We need to go to our tables, and we need to click the table we just created. And we need to look for what is called the ARN, the Amazon Resource Name, okay? We'll need this in a moment. And we'll come back to policy, all right? So keep in mind the ARN. I'll show you again if you missed it, if I'm going a little too fast here, but keep in mind that ARN, right? We're going to add a few services here. So the first one we're going to add is CloudWatch logs. And we're going to allow, now this is important here, okay? You don't want to just be lazy and click allow all right? Because you have to keep in mind that this is from a player's perspective. This is the policy that is going to be attached to players when they're in your backend. So you want to really limit what they're allowed to do. So in our cases, all that we need to do is write. All right, we're just going to give them write permissions. And actually, I'm sorry, we're not going to do it this way. We're actually going to come over to the JSON. The visual is nice. You can do that, but we're actually going to come over to the JSON, and we're going to edit the JSON directly, okay? All right. I'll make sure I have these policies for you in the description, and I'll make sure I explain them here as well. I'm going to copy in this policy that I have here and remove a few things right here. Don't worry, I'm going to explain this all to you. So what we're essentially giving, and you can kind of see what we're working with here. We're allowing it to read and write to a table, and we're going to allow it to we're going to allow it to write to CloudWatch logs. CloudWatch logs are cloud logging that allows you to see what's going on with stuff. It's very helpful for debugging your Lambda functions. This is, however, where we're going to want the ARN. So best policy is only to give access as much access as your application needs. If your application does not need specifically to access it, don't give it permission to do so. So right here, we're giving it the ability to read and write to a table, but we're only allowing it to read and write to the player data table that we just created. And again, if you forgot where that is in your DynamoDB, that is your ARN right here. Everything that you create at Amazon has an ARN value. This is the identifier internally on your account that determines what the resource is on AWS's side. This is also unique, so it does, we're not going to get into it, but it does work globally. But just know that this is like an ID or an identifier for this particular resource. Okay, so come over to your table, overview, ARN, throw that into your resource field. Okay, the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to kind of copy this part right here. This is our actual table name. I'm replacing, you're going to want to replace as well. I'll put some placeholder values in here for you. But we want to put it right here to player data. That is our actual table name. We want to be able to access the stream. The stream is how we're going to be scanning the table and how we're going to be getting this information. Then down below, this is okay. It is okay for us, for the Lambda function to create its own log group and for it to write to that log group, all right? You could create specific log groups manually and do the same thing that we do up here. Only allow it to write to those specific log groups. Log groups are not as important to protect as if there's not really a huge concern with writing to a log group on it. You could do it. We're not really going to. So again, I'll make sure I have this policy for you in the description. Just make sure that we're changing the resource name and the resource down here. Okay, just make sure that we're changing that over. And again, note that these resource names are region specific. So you want to copy whatever your resource name is. Okay. Now, if we go back over to the visual, this is why I like the JSON a little bit better. This is a little bit easier to work with, in my opinion. You are also more than welcome to do the visual side. So if I go over to the visual side, you can see I've added DynamoDB and CloudWatch logs. So I've given it specific permissions inside of the read. We've given it specific permissions inside of the write. And you'll notice, again, we're not giving it all write. We're only giving it specific writes. So we can't delete backups. We can't, because again, we don't want them to be able to do everything. We just want them to be able to do what they need to be able to do. And then in this one, we have getting the records, which is your stream. Okay, and then in CloudWatch Logs is a write on creating log stream and putting log events. And then we also have a write on creating a log group. Okay, so you're more than welcome to go through here and do the visual permissions. If you are seeing the JSON, they are named exactly this. Okay, I will also include the JSON because, like I said, it's a little easier to copy and paste a template and then edit it how you want, and then just let the visual figure it out. Whichever is easier for you, do that. So we're going to hit next. We're going to name our policy name. I'm just going to name this tutorial policy so I can find it a little bit later. Tutorial policy. I like adding what this is for, so I might name this, for example, player policy. Because we may use this policy for more things in the future to allow the player to access other services. This is the policy that the player is going to be using. So I'm going to create that policy. Now we're going to go to roles. I know this is a little bit of jumping around. I apologize for that. Role is going to be a little easier here. We're going to want to create a new role. And again, let me open up my my notes. We're going to want to create a role, and we're going to want to make a role for an AWS service. So as you can see, this is a trusted entity. We're wanting to make we're wanting to allow whatever we attach as role to access whatever we want, whatever resource we want. So this specific resource that we're going to attach it to is a Lambda function, okay? So this role can only be attached to Lambda functions, which is what we want because we're going to be using this role for a Lambda function in the future. Once we select Lambda, we're going to hit next, and it's going to ask us to add permissions. For the permissions, we're going to add that policy that we just made. So I'm going to search for tutorial policy player, and I'm going to say that that is the permissions for it. Okay. And it will tell us, it will give us kind of an overview of the trust policy. It will auto fill in our role, and it will tell us that it is going to assume the role. So this is what I'm talking about. It's attaching the role to your player. All right. And we'll explain that a little bit more once we get into API Gateway, how the role gets onto the player. For now, don't worry about it. For the role name, we're going to call this tutorial. And then the type of role it is, so Lambda. And then, actually, yeah, we're just going to keep it like that. We're just going to say tutorial Lambda. You could put player here as well if you want. I don't think you need to. I think this is enough to show you that this is the Lambda for your project. Feel free to name this how you want them. And we're going to create this role. Okay. That is it for the permissions section of that. We're going to come back into Lambdas. So we're going to search for, in our search bar up here, we're going to search for Lambda. And we're going to create a new function, okay? We're going to end up creating 4 functions. We need one to update the character, one to get the player data, one to create the character, and one to delete the character. You could put all this into one function if you would like. Personally, I like splitting it up just because it's a little bit more clear of what's happening. And if something breaks, you don't have to worry about which part of your code broke. You know which function you have to go to. So the first one we're going to create, we're just going to start at the top. We're going to start at tutorial get player data. And you'll notice it's complaining about me. You cannot have spaces. You could use hyphens, underscores, no spaces on this. We're going to use the runtime node 18 just because that's the one that I find works the best. You can do node 20. Sometimes there are syntax changes between the different Node.js versions. So if you're having some problems with the code you're seeing me write and the syntax isn't working for you, it's probably your Node version. You're either going to have to look up the syntax for your specific Node version or just use the Node version that I have here. It doesn't change a lot, but just keep in mind that it does. Next, we're going to want to make sure that we change the default execution role. We're going to want to use an existing role, and then we're going to want to select that tutorial Lambda role that we made in the previous step. And we're going to go ahead and want to create the function. Okay, we're going to have a blank function now here for player data. Again, I'm going to make sure that you have this code in the description. I'm going to make sure that all this is there for you, but I'm going to copy in the completed code, and we're going to walk through it just real briefly to show you how this all works. We are going to make a few minor notes. So first of all, this table name variable up here, we need to change that to what our actual table name is. So in the tutorial's case, this would be player data. All right. Next, what we are doing, we're doing some login events. Now, these login events, if you console.log here, these will show up in CloudWatch logs, which I'll show you how to get to if you need to debug your function here, all right? We're grabbing the player ID, which is going to come from our context sub and our context email. I will show you what this is when we get to the API gateway side. Just for now, trust me that the Lambda is getting the authentication from Cognito in this function, okay? But I will show you how that works. We're going to create a default player data. This is the default fields when we were explaining in DynamoDB. These are the default fields that are going to get created for DynamoDB. So for me, I have an ID, which is going to link to the player ID that is passed in. I have an array for characters, and I have an array for achievements, okay? So that is what I have right now. You're welcome to add more, less here. Like I said, DynamoDB is really good if you want to add in the future. So don't feel like you have to have your life figured out here. Okay, you can change it as we go on. Okay, then we're going to do some variable initialization. We're going to initialize the player item and the response codes. All right. We're going to do a get command. This get command is talking directly to DynamoDB, and we're going to get the ID of the player. Now, if you did it exactly like I have and your primary key is called ID, this will work fine for you. If you called this anything other than ID, like you called it player ID or player underscore ID, you will need to change this right here to whatever you called it. Not over here. This is the value right here. This is what you're looking for, okay? So we're going to grab that. We are then going to do a... I have to remember my own code. We're going to do a put command. I think that's actually... you know, it's funny. I think that's actually left over for something. But, oh, no. I'm sorry. Sorry. It's been a while since I've been in this code, so I'll explain what we're doing here in a minute. So we're going to get the response data, okay? And we're going to send that get command, which is up here, to grab the player. And we're going to log that, again, for logging purposes and for debugging, okay? We're then going to check if we found an item, okay? So we're going to say if get response data item is... if we found something, if we found the item data, like we found the player, we got the player, we retrieved it. This is kind of up to you. I'm auto creating a new player if we don't find anything. So if this is blank, if we do not have an item, it means that DynamoDB could not find our field, and it's going to create a player instead. Okay, so we're creating a player instead using our put command up here, and then right down here, I'm setting different response codes. So I'm setting this response message of player data retrieved successfully, or new player created, and the player item is refresh. The player item in our case is going to be the actual JSON data that is going to be retrieved from the database, okay? And then we're going to return the response back up to API Gateway, all right? Once we're done with all that, we're going to hit deploy, all right? We'll go through the other functions a little bit as well. We'll make it a little bit quicker because I'll have you go through the code. Like I said, I'm going to provide the code, but you'll want to look through and make sure that this is all working on your end as well. If you do need to check the logs, so you're adding stuff to this and you need to check the logs. If you go to monitor and you click the view CloudWatch logs right here, you will not have this until you run this Lambda function for the first time. But once you run it for the first time, you will have a CloudWatch log that you can see all the logging data for this Lambda function. So that's pretty sweet, all right? Okay, let's move on. That is the get player data command. The next one we're going to make is we're going to make a create character, all right? Same thing. We're going to name this tutorial create character. We're going to make this node 18. We're going to make sure we change our execution role to the role that we have selected, that we made, and we're going to create the function, right? Now, create character is, all these functions are almost identical. They're just very differences here. So in this one, again, we're getting these two variables from Cognito. This is a staple. I also have a max characters defined here. You're going to want to define max characters on this level because your player can't change it. They can't edit it. The concern is if you edit it, if you add this in Unreal Engine, for example, the player could potentially edit this and make more characters than they're allowed to. So you always want to make sure that Lambda is the authority on whether or not we're doing these functions, because the Lambda code cannot be changed. Only you can change this, okay? Same thing as before. We're defining a default character that is going to be shoved into player data. Now, something to note here. For preventing cheating, you're going to want to limit very much what your player is allowed to submit to the API. So as you can see here, I only have a name and customization string. So the player is only allowed to request, this is what I want my name to be, and this is what I would like my customization to be. They are not allowed to request anything else. So you can see that I have object data here and I have region. So if you wanted to define where your player started, I would do it here. Because again, the player cannot change that. The concern that you have, kind of like with replication in Unreal Engine, you want to think of this from the player. If the player is allowed, because this function will do whatever you want, you want to make sure that the player is getting checked here, that they are not allowed to request something that they should not be requesting, or set something in the database that they should not be setting. Okay. So we're going to continue on. We're not going to go through as in-depth of an application. Like I said, it's the same thing. We're going through. We're first doing a get command to see if we have a player already, because we're going to need this in a minute. We're letting the character name equal unique right now for 0. We're looping through all the character names. Now, I'm going to change this code up a little bit in the future. I'll make sure to do a follow-up video when I do that. Right now, this is checking to see if the character name is unique within the user's account. This is not going to check if it is globally unique. So this won't prevent players from having the same character name. If you want to do that, be on the lookout for my follow-up for that. Or let me know and I can kind of talk through my idea with that with you. But this is making sure that the character name is unique. The reason we need to, at a minimum, make sure that the character name is unique is because in the front end, we're going to be using the character name as our identifier for when we're pulling all of this information. Okay. Now, the create is going to just append a new element of this array. I'm sorry, this array up here. It's just going to append a new element to the character array that we defined earlier. Okay, and it will return different functions depending upon what its status was. So if we were able to, we create the character. If the name was not unique, so the for loop failed, we're going to return. You have to choose a unique name. If the character, if we got a request from the player, but they're already at 3 characters in this example, we're going to let them know that, hey, you already have the maximum number of characters. So we're going to put that in here. Again, make sure that your table name is here. If you want to use this code as is, this is the only variable you need to change. The only other one, again, that you need to make sure is if you called your primary key, your partition key, something different, make sure you're changing that here. All right. Okay, let's move on. That is the create character function. We're going to create another one. And for this one, we're going to do update character next because this one's a little bit weird. I may end up updating this one. This is how I got this to work. Updating works a little bit weird in DynamoDB. I wasn't able to find a good way to have DynamoDB do the update for me. So we're doing the update code manually in Lambda, which is okay. It's better to have DynamoDB do it, but we don't really have that option in this case, at least from what I was able to find. So again, name our function, Node.js 18, using our existing role for the tutorial, using our existing role for the Lambda function, okay? And we're going to create that function as well. Again, code will be in description, but we're going to move over the completed code. Again, make sure that your table name is called what your table name is called. So in this case, it is player data. Make sure that your primary keys are set correctly. And we're going to have a few different things here. We are actually additionally passing in a server auth key. My plan for this code is that only the server, so when you're in Unreal Engine, only the server instance is allowed to call this function, because again, you do not necessarily want a player allowed to update their own character, because if they are, the player could just update themselves to be in, they could just teleport, right? They could just teleport to something else, or they could set different things. So you still want this server to control what the player is allowed to do, this is how we're going to do that. All right. So we're making sure we have an authorization key. Right now, for just my testing purposes, we're just going to have this as 1234. We're going to come back and change this when we actually get into more of the authentication stuff. But for right now, we're just making sure we have a server auth key. We're preparing it for to have that auth key. Now, the update code. It's a little unconventional, I guess is the word I'll use. We're looping through all of the characters that we currently have, okay? The first thing we actually do is we clear out the character array. Now, I do want to change this a little bit. I'm just not sure on a good way to change this because there is a potential gotcha that if this Lambda function fails before the next section of code, or you make a typo in something and this Lambda is not doing it, you may clear your player's characters out. That's not a great way to handle this, and I recognize that. I still need to look into what the alternative is, because this is one of the only ways that I figured out how to do this. If you have a better way, more than happy to hear it. Please let me know. If I find a better way, I'll make sure to talk about what that better way is. But we're sending a blank array, so we're clearing out all the characters. Note we do cache it, though. We do cache what the characters were first in this function. Then we're looping through everything, and this is why it was important that we are checking that the name is unique, because we're actually going to check if the name is equal to the name that we were passed in. All right, whatever character we're passing in. It does support renaming your character if that is something that you would like to do. So the user, or not the user, but when you call this function, you can set whether a new name is available. And again, just to explain this here, event.characterinfo.name. When we get into our next part here, I'll show you what that is, but this is specifically getting variables that are set by API Gateway when it calls this. I'll show you where those are, but just for right now, trust me that these variables get passed in, and I'll show you where we're defining those variables. All right. So we're looping through all the characters. We're checking if and actually this is outdated code here. That function should not be if that's what we want to delete. Deletes work the same way, so that's why that is there. So we're updating it. We're going through. We're checking if this is the character we want to update. We're setting the new information and then adding it. If it is not the character, so if we go here, if it's not, we're just adding it as is. We're not editing it at all. Okay. And then we're returning an invalid request if we couldn't find a server key, or an updated if we updated that. Okay, we're gonna deploy that. Make sure that's set up. Okay, final function before we get into API Gateway. API Gateway is a little bit faster, I do promise. The code section is the biggest part. The final one is going to be delete character. Now, I have chosen to allow players to delete their own character. There is not much, again, note 18, choose your execution role. There's not much reason to not allow a character to delete their own character. There's not many security concerns on it. This code works almost identically to the update character. The only difference is if the character name we passed in does match, we're not re-adding it to the array. Otherwise, we do add it to the array. That's basically what is happening here. So if this is the character that we are adding, we don't add it. So that's what that is doing here. Again, same thing. Make sure your table name is changed to player data. Make sure your primary key is set if it is not. All right, and we're going to deploy. Okay, we are done with DynamoDB now and with Lambda. Let's get into API Gateway, or get back into API Gateway, I should say. So we're going to get back into API Gateway. We're going to go into the API that you created, and we're going to fill this out a little bit. Now, how you structure this is entirely up to you. You can determine what the URLs are on your own. So, first thing we're going to do, I'm going to put this as player. All right. We're not going to enable any of these other things. And we're going to create a resource. So this is going to be /player. So it will be your URL, which I will show you in a moment here. It'll be your URL /player. Under player, we're going to come over here to methods, and we're going to create a method. And the method that we want is a get method. And actually, I'm sorry for the back and forth. We're going to set one thing up before we get into this, okay? We're going to come over to authorizers first, okay? And we're going to create an authorizer. The authorizer name is going to be, we're just going to name this Cognito authorizer, okay? Now, we're going to choose this as Cognito. You could also do Lambda, but because we created Cognito in the first video, we want this API to only be called by all logged in users, okay? So Cognito, choose the region that you created your Cognito API in, and if you just click in the search box, it's not going to update for me because I forgot that I deleted the user pool from the last video. But you are going to I'll select the one for my project right now, but you would select your user pool that you have here. Okay, it will populate with your user pool. Don't worry about these fields right here. Don't need them at this point. So we'll create authorizer, and we're gonna get an error. Why are we getting the error though? The source must be a method request header matching method or request header. Interesting. Okay. Hold on. Let me verify my notes. I may have something wrong. Oh, I'm sorry. We do need this part. For token source, we want authorization. You technically can call this whatever you want. Authorization makes the most sense to me, but you could call this field whatever you want, just as long as on your front end you're using the same field. Okay, that is my bad. That was a blunder on my part. You do need the first field. You do not need the second field. There we go. Authorizer created. Beautiful. And we have our authorizer now. Now, back in our resources, we're going to, under our /player, create a method. And this method, this is the API request method that is going to be used to call this. So we're going to call it a get method. We're going to choose a Lambda function because we want to call a Lambda function from this method. The Lambda function, again, make sure your region. The Lambda function that we want to call is, can you guess? If I can find it, let's sort it here. It's going to be tutorial get player data. So click that. It will autofill in the ARN for you. Okay. All right. We don't need to do much in here. We do need to set up a request body, however. And actually, we're going to come back to this. I don't know why, but you can't edit it very well in this window. So I usually come back to this. The other thing that I always forget in this screen, you can edit it later, but make sure you come under request methods. Under authorization, choose your authorizer that you made. So mine was called Cognito. Choose your authorizer here. Don't need any of these other fields. Okay, and you'll see that we have our authorization Cognito. So this URL can only be accessed if the user is logged in. All right. Now we need to do a few things here. Again, I'm going to make sure that we go over this. We will be setting up mapping templates, and I'll explain what mapping templates are. Those are the variables that we'll be setting up. We actually don't need any variables for the get. And actually, I'm sorry, that is wrong. We do need it for the get. So we're going to come over to integration request. You can also just click on this tab, or you can click integration request up here. and we're going to scroll down to mapping templates. Now, I have a big screen, so you may not want to scroll down, but we're going to edit up here. All right. We're going to scroll down. We're going to mapping templates. We're going to add a mapping template. The content type is going to be application/JSON. Again, I will make sure that all of this is included for you. Now, if you remember from the Lambda function, we had these two mysterious variables called sub and email. This is where we define that. Okay, so this is the context that is going to be passed in from API gateway to our Lambda function. All right, so we're defining this as sub and email. You can call these different variables if you want. Just keep in mind you have to change it in your Lambda function. We are getting these, as you can see, from our authorizer that we set up. So this is automatically going to pull and fill in what our sub is, which is the ID of the Cognito request, and the user's email. There are other fields that you can specify here if you would like, and you can use this little learn more button here to see what all the fields are if you would like more. For my purposes, this is fine. We really only need the ID. We technically don't even need the email, but we're going to pull the email in as well. So we're going to save that. Okay. Now, this is all set up now. This will call our function on it. You won't be able to test this very well just because you need to be authorized in Cognito. If you try to call this URL, you should be getting a 403 forbidden. If you want to test this to make sure that it is working, just turn your authorizer off. Just blank this out if you would like to test it. Okay. We're going to come back up to player now, and we're going to make another resource. Again, call this what you want, but I think that character makes the most sense. So /player/character. And we're going to have 3 methods for this. Not a resource, sorry. Under character, method, create method. First method we're going to have is going to be a post. And if you're wondering why we don't have a get here, remember that the get under player returns the character list. So if you're confused why we're going to have 3 methods and not 4, that's why. If you'd like to make a method to specifically just get it here, more power to you. I've just chosen in my design to return it in the get player. So we're going to have a post. The post is going to call a Lambda function. We're going to make sure that we have our region selected correctly. I'm going to search for tutorial, and we're going to call create character. And we're going to, under method request settings, ensure that we set our authorizer and create the method. Next, we're going to create another not a resource. I don't know why I keep clicking that. We're going to create another method, and this one is going to be patch. Now, we might change this in my testing that is coming in future videos. Varest does not appear to have a patch method, so we may circle back on this in one of the videos. But for now, we're going to do patch. Patch is the equivalent of update, essentially. So in this one, we're going to call update character. We're going to ensure that our authorizer is set. And we're going to create the method. Great. And finally, we're going to create one more method, and we're going to make this delete. And this one is going to be... Did I forget to append that? I did forget to append that. This one for me is called delete character. Call your Lambda function. And again, as always, we're going to make sure that we have the Cognito authorization. Okay. We're just about done. I know this has been a long one. Thank you for sticking in with this one. We need to set up the mapping templates for each of these methods now. So same as before, we're going to click on integration requests. We're going to click edit. We're going to come down to mapping templates. We're going to add a mapping template. This is for the delete character. Delete, okay? So in here, you can define whatever you want here, remember, but you have to define the most important information. So if you wanted to add extra, what I mean by that is if you wanted to add extra variables that API or that Lambda can use, this is where you would do that. For the delete character, all we need is the sub again, the email. And if you remember, we had a variable in the Lambda called event.characterinfo.name. That's where this is coming from. Event is in Lambda side, but we're passing in a JSON object of character info and name. And where that's coming from is an input parameter. So when you're in a URL and you type the little question mark and you say name equals whatever, that's what this is. That's where we're getting this variable from. So whatever the user determines is the name. And we're going to save that. Okay. We'll come down to patch next, since it's in that order. We'll hit integration request again. We'll hit edit. And we will, in the mapping templates, add a mapping template. Content type is application/JSON. And again, I will make sure that all this is in the description for you so that you can have a little bit easier of a time. Same thing as before, we're going to pass in a context of the sub and email. This is a staple if we're using an authorizer because this is how we're determining what user it is so that Lambda knows which field in the database to pull out from. Okay, this is their ID. Next, I've chosen to include a server auth key, which I've grouped in server auth key. That way, when the server is updating it, the server will provide an authorization key. So that way, API gateway and Lambda knows that this is a server authenticated request. It is not a player doing this. If you don't care about that, feel free to omit it. Next, we have a character info, but we have a bigger character info array. We're actually taking in the name, the new name, so we can support renames, the customization, the object data, and the region. All right. So we're specifying in, again, these are all input parameters. We're specifying what we want from API gateway to pass to Lambda. And we're going to save that. And last but certainly not least, we're going to come to post. We're going to click on our integration request. We're going to edit it. We're going to come under mapping templates. We're going to add a mapping template. We're going to call this application/JSON. I'm going to grab my code. We're going to pop that in here. Remember that create is a lot smaller. We're only allowing the player to specify name and customization on the Lambda side. So that's all we need to specify on the API gateway side. And then, as always, we're pulling in the information for the authorizer, in this case, Cognito. We're going to save that. Okay. That is the backend set up for multiplayer. I know this was a much longer video. I do apologize for that. There's a lot of information that goes into making these backends, and it took many more hours that you have not seen coming up with just kind of how this all comes together. Because these three are so interlinked, I wanted to kind of explain and go through all three of them. If you did have any questions, if I didn't explain something very clearly, please let me know. I am more than happy to walk you through things, help debug, and clarify anything that I maybe did not explain very well. I'm very comfortable with this system, so there may be times where I skip over something that I should not be skipping over. If I did that for you, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to help you out. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. We do have a Patreon down below if you would like to provide a little bit of support here. Not required, no pressure whatsoever. Do appreciate anyone who does that, but it's not required at all. Thank you for making it all the way through the video if you have made it this far. If you do have questions, let me know. Discord, YouTube comments, whatever's convenient for you. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, everyone.